we've got a Democratic senator with us, Chris Coons. He's actually a member of the Judiciary Committee, also Foreign Relations. So, Senator Coons, welcome to the program. I know I had you on, booked you for other reasons, but I'm curious, now that you've seen that the Senate Intel Committee has subpoenaed Donald Trump Jr., essentially it looks like for testimony that, not that he gave the Intel Committee, but over questions about testimony he gave to the Judiciary Committee, would you like to see your chairman add a subpoena for Donald Trump Jr. back in front of your committee?
Absolutely, Chuck. I think one of the things that's at risk here, that's at stake here, is the reputation of Congress for its ability and willingness to conduct meaningful oversight. We had in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee a number of witnesses, including Donald Trump Jr. I, of course, don't know specifically what the subpoena from the Senate Intelligence Committee is about. This has just broken in the press within, I think, the last hour or two. But as you're suggesting in your question, Chuck, it's entirely possible that it was the Judiciary Committee questioning of Donald Trump Jr. and the difference that was revealed in the Mueller report transcript that led to this subpoena. It's entirely possible that there were other aspects of the Trump Tower meeting or of the Trump Tower project in Moscow that led to this subpoena. I'll just close, Chuck, by saying one of the things I find encouraging about this is that it's a reminder that in the Senate, in our Intelligence Committee, there continues to be real bipartisanship in the pursuit of ultimately the truth about some of these important matters that were raised but have not yet been resolved.
Do you think the House was correct, the House Judiciary Committee today was correct to hold the Attorney General in contempt, or is it too soon?
You know, look, I'm not on the House Judiciary Committee. The press accounts I've heard suggest that they tried again with the Attorney General. I had the Attorney General in front of me on the Senate Judiciary Committee recently, and I frankly thought the tone and content of his testimony to us suggested that he sees himself not as the people's attorney, not as someone representing the people of the United States and tasked, charged with defending the Constitution and rule of law, but as President Trump's personal defense attorney. That's the tone and flavor of a number of his important word choices and his conduct in the hearing. That was my personal direct experience. I don't know what the House Judiciary Committee did in order to extend themselves repeatedly, but my strong impression is that they reached the appropriate conclusion here after a number of attempts that were thwarted by the Attorney General and ultimately by the President.
Where are you on this question of impeachment? I mean, you've got some of your colleagues. Elizabeth Warren says it must start now. Nancy Pelosi says keep investigating. Not yet, though she seems to today indicate he might want to self-impeach. We'll debate that with the panel. Where are you on this?
I think we should listen to the Speaker of the House. It is the House of Representatives from which articles of impeachment would have to come. I will tell you there are not the votes in the Senate to remove the president from office. He has strong and loyal supporters in the Republican majority here in the Senate. And absent some bombshell revelation that we did not receive in the Mueller report, I think the odds of his removal through an impeachment process are close to zero.
I'm curious, why is that? Why should that be the factor? If you believe the process, if this is all about the Constitution, how do you know what the outcome's going to be? I mean, we think we know what the outcome's going to be, but how do you know? And should that be the decider that, you don't bring something to trial because, well, we know what the outcome is? That's not how the rule of law is supposed to work.
That's right, Chuck. If this were a garden variety, a criminal case where we didn't know the jury and we didn't know how they would respond to the charges and the evidence, it would be inappropriate to prejudge it and say, let's not even bring the case. But in this instance, we know the jury, and we know the jury very well. And we know the jury's public and private statements and actions on anything that would challenge President Trump's view of things. The other issue here is that we have limited time because we're not a jury. We're the Senate of the United States. In the impeachment process, we act as a jury. But my concern is that if we take up the entire next year and a half in what would be very contentious and very grinding impeachment proceedings, we would not be legislating to answer the issues that the average American wants us working together to solve. That's what they're going to judge us on in the 2020 elections, and we have to be mindful of both roles that we are charged with here in Congress.
So you're making more of a political argument about this than necessarily a legal argument.
That's correct. It is a political process. The Constitution entrusts to the Congress the potential impeachment and removal of the president. It is sort of a quasi-judicial process. It is a political process because we are all elected officials. And frankly, the fact that we are not serving solely as a jury, we're also serving as a Senate and a House, and we have limited time and resources, is what leads me to say the report is public. We should continue investigations. We should make sure the American people know about the misdeeds of the president and his top advisors. But we frankly should also try and legislate to solve the problems the average American faces.
It also sounds like you think in 2020 the jury ought to be the voter.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Let me ask you one question about Iran before I let you go. I know you're very focused on, you've been very focused on the Iran deal at its conception, where it is now. Some European countries are thinking about putting sanctions back, considering the move that Iran announced yesterday. Do you think the European signers of this are making the right call?
I think it's important that we re-engage with our vital allies on this issue. It was really only because of the coordinated pressure of our core allies around the world that we were able to get Iran to the to the bargaining table and get them to give up searching and comprehensive inspections of their entire nuclear enrichment and weapons program. So I think we should be acting in concert with Germany, France, the UK, and I think that would be the right thing for us to do with them.
Okay, but does that mean you think we have already put sanctions back? Should they now?
Yes. I think that was the right thing for us to do. And as Iran takes steps in that direction, we should do it with our European allies.
All right. Democratic Senator Chris Coons, I know it's been busy today. Thank you for talking about both of those breaking news stories plus Iran. Much appreciated. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.